Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, February 10th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as I do every week, I want to thank those of you right at the top of the show who make Talk Nerdy possible. If you are interested in supporting the show on an episodic basis, I recommend you go to patreon.com/talknerdy. Do it in your browser, not in the app. All right, this week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, and, Rico Maharaj and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it without any time to waste. I had the wonderful opportunity to speak today with Dr. Rina Bliss. She is the author of the previous books, Rethinking Intelligence, Race Decoded, and Social by Nature. She's an associate professor of sociology at Rutgers University, and she has a new book out. It's called What's Real About Race? Untangling Science, Genetics, and Society. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Rina Bliss. Well, Surekha, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I am very excited to talk about your new book. This is your second book, if I'm not mistaken, called Humans, A Monstrous History. But before we get into that, which I feel like is very relevant right now, I would love to get to a little bit of your background. So would you call yourself a historian of science and art? How do you define your sort of academic role?
Suppose I would say I'm a historian of science, art, and ideas, especially of science.
Science, art, and ideas. Of course, the things that really make us human. And what a theme for this book. So tell me a little bit about what it was or what it is about monsters that drew you in, maybe personally, maybe academically, and sort of spoke to you to say, hey, you could do an entire book about this.
I think personally it started incredibly early. My earliest memories are of watching The Muppet Show. Very, very single digits years old, 4. And, gradually thinking, well, why isn't the actual world like this? Everybody is, kind of happy and anarchic. And pretty soon I was watching Star Trek and thinking the same thing in a slightly different way, and really appreciating that feeling of mind blownness that the crew of The Next Generation felt, regularly as they encountered, beings who are actually capable of turning into slime and back, or could practice telepathy. I mean, that was almost normal on Star Trek. Initially, I wanted to be an intergalactic explorer because too much Star Trek, and I started my BA as a theoretical physicist. But, take a quantum mechanics class and you realize there will be no warp drive anytime soon. And so I and, half the physics cohort had a midlife crisis at 19, the ones who watched too much television. And I became a historian of science, which was actually a very easy kind of transfer where I was an undergraduate. And I became a historian of exploration, but, right from the start, what was that original dissertation thesis about? It was about Spaniards, going to the Americas. And I think it was those kind of first contact moments where people think about what it means to be them, which, as we've seen in kind of human history, are moments where choices get made that then have very long repercussions, choices that shape law. And, my first book for my PhD was about how European map makers made sense of peoples of the Americas, people far away where the climate is different. How different are they? And, when I became a college professor, one of the classes I taught was history of monsters in European thought and culture up to about 1800. So basically the before Frankenstein, cultural history. And so I knew that a lot of, my students who were very interested in how people tell on themselves through the stories they tell about monsters, because they're also actually stories about what people mean by human, what people
Oh,
mean
yeah.
by normal, and also how we feel about where an individual person ends and everything out there beyond our skin begins, which also shapes how people act in the world and the kinds of decisions they make about the environment or fail to make, where you see how people think about that boundary. And, some cultures and some individuals are happy with there being a continuum from them to, other people, to other beings. It, enlarges their own possibilities. But when people try to see themselves as very separate from other people or other beings, then you have to sort of disappear any examples that turn that show that actually we live in a continuum.
Absolutely. Gosh, there's so much to unpack here, and I can't help but be reminded of an interview I did at this point a couple of years ago, I think, with a psychologist out here on the West Coast. I think from Stanford, named Brian Lowry, who wrote a book about the self and how this idea of self is kind of by definition only arrived at in relation to others, that there is no self without the other, and that how we define who we are and develop that concept of self has to do with our kind of interdependence or our intersubjectivity with other individuals. And, a couple of things that you pointed to, which I think I kind of want to go back to, was this early research that you were doing into exploration. And I'd
Mm.
love for you to share with my audience. I would say is probably 50 to 75% American. I have a
Mhm.
pretty English speaking audience around other parts of the globe, obviously the UK, Australia, parts of Africa, other parts of Europe. But here in America, I can say that there is obviously a deeply sort of white supremacist bias, even to our educational system, especially at like elementary or primary levels. And so you don't often start to contemplate the idea of kind of global exploration as colonialism and as violence until you start to become more sophisticated in your, I think, worldview. But early on, these stories are often told in the most sanitized way. They're told in a way that's celebratory and that's very, oh, these great explorers set sail to foreign lands, and then they discovered this thing that had never been discovered before, and they went in, and so this conflict, this violence, this conquest, this idea of a colonial intentionality is sort of something that I think many young people come to understand as they develop intellectually, and some people kind of never do.
It's the great unnecessary myth of the age. And I
Mm.
say, why do I say it's kind of unnecessary? It doesn't serve even the people who think it protects them and, makes them better. And, I'm drawn to a very unlikely parallel, but also a utopian one, which is somehow even more unlikely, which is the movie Monsters Incorporated.
Okay.
And which, it was a really foundational, movie for me, watching it a little before I, began my PhD. It's about 20 years old. And, and later I would, start my PhD. In it, humans are the monsters. We're looking at the world of, called Monstropolis, where every creature is sort of a cartoon monster. It's a Pixar movie, but they think uh, human children are toxic. Anything might happen if a human child ends up in their world in Monstropolis. And yet, monsters will go into children's bedrooms at night, scare them, and collect their screams, because
Mhm.
that is the power on which Monstropolis runs. And so this is, a intentionally or not, it's a metaphor for colonialism or a kind of imperial extraction, kind of going in and gathering something. And by the end of the movie, we learn that screams aren't as powerful as laughter. So instead of frightening the children, they could have been telling them jokes. And I think some of the monster making myths of today they're immensely harmful to, the people who are monstrified by stories about how they're threatening, or they're not, fully members of civil society. They don't deserve all the civil rights that, quote unquote, actual normal default people do. It's a tragedy because there is no zero sum for being human, but that's what that story creates. We're on a scarce planet, but that's kind of because we are failing to actually acknowledge that, and failing to recognize that everybody is a person with an extraordinary and unique brain. There we are trying to, not you and I, but there are people who just want to, create simulation bots to make stuff and think, the goal is to colonize Mars. And I tell you what, once there were like rich people going to space, that was it. It was like pressing a button. It was no longer one of those dream things for me. And I don't know how many other people who wanted to be scientists and astronauts when they were 8 stopped wanting to be one once you just needed to pay money to go into outer space. But our bodies are so intertwined with the microbiome of the other beings on Earth. We wouldn't be us if we couldn't replenish that. That's another tragedy, that attempt at kind of alienating the human being from, the beings on Earth, instead of thinking of us as a much bigger symbiotic, system where we might also have responsibilities towards the beings that also nourish us.
Absolutely. I want to talk soon, but I'm going to hold off on a little bit about, I don't know, I don't want to say the fun side of this, but like about the history of sort of literature and film and poetry and myth and the monsters that have been created or developed in the human mind that have informed or influenced behavior and told stories. But there's sort of the other side of this conversation is exactly what we've been pointing to, which is the idea that monsters are a construct that are often used as a means of social control and social influence in an effort to either maintain power or in an effort to minimize the other, right? And we see this in the genocidal playbook. We see this, obviously, there's been a lot of talk lately about 1930s Germany. We've been talking about these sort of early colonial violent excursions. And I can't help, when I booked this, I didn't know it would be this bad, but I can't help but bring up the elephant in the room right now, which is the last 2 weeks here in the United States since it's so weird to even say it, since the new president was inaugurated, and a flurry of executive orders have been written that are just following this playbook to a T. This idea of dehumanizing, minimizing the other in an effort to paint them as subhuman, paint them as separate. And when something is subhuman, it's much easier to commit violence against them, to strip them of their rights. And I'm just curious, as you've been watching from across the pond and you have so much expertise in this area, what has your experience been sort of watching the news?
Let's just say I've watched rather less of it in the last 2 weeks than I usually do. It is eerily familiar. The parallels that many people have been drawing have been with Nazi Germany, where, trans people, disabled people, groups who have been seen as kind of ethnic minorities against whom monstrifying stories have been circulating for some time, are being, reframed as threats to be disappeared in one way or another, whether that's in detention centers or by deciding they don't exist because suddenly, we're going to pretend that humanity lives in two genders when that has never, ever been the case. There has always been a continuum. And of course, attacking birthright citizenship again, is a kind of way of separating, passing out citizens and deciding that some of them aren't actually straightforward citizens and pushing them towards a complete non-citizen status. So that it's that you can almost kind of, for me, it's kind of almost visible. You can kind of see where the kind of blurry edges between citizens of the United States and people who are citizens of other countries, people are being pushed to that margin and kind of corralled there almost to kind of create a kind of border that's almost this demilitarized zone, between, say, the US and Latin America, demilitarized zone that's being, in people's minds, populated with people who are, labeled as quote unquote illegal immigrants. But when you think about the fact that of kind of so many undocumented people in the US, kind of millions and millions pay taxes and they have jobs. So jobs exist, but the categories that allow, these people to actually become naturalized citizens, those paths are very difficult and limited. But when you think, going back to what you were saying earlier about the colonization of what became the United States by people from Europe, those stories are not about illegitimate land grabs. It's not about the enslavement and genocide of Native Americans. It's not about Africans, kidnapped. But if you think about what U.S. citizenship even is, what is that? What is it built on? What is that nation built on? And then it's you can see the houses of cards built on the sand of declaring that some people who came in ships from Europe discovered this continent. And what I used to say to my students is, well, Columbus didn't discover the New World. There were people already there. Who got there first? Well, maybe it was the Patagonians, the people who'd gotten all the way down to the south of, South America. Most people the first people in the Americas, came across that land bridge. Not all, there were some ships and, I'm not an archaeologist. These are stories that people tell about what nations are legitimate and what powers they are morally, entitled to wield. But we, as a species, need to, be willing to think about what the evidence actually is and not what we think would be convenient. And none of us were alive when a whole lot of horrible stuff was happening, but we are alive now to think about what we permit and what stories we tell as well.
Absolutely. And I think maybe it would benefit us to sort of go back a little bit and dive into the connection, the parallel that you make in the book. And such a beautiful example is simply the cover. I'm not sure if the American version of the book is the same as the UK version.
It is.
It is. Okay, good.
It is.
Yeah. So it's, Humans, A Monstrous History. And the cover is a mirror. Right? It's you looking yourself in the face. And then, of course, the mirror is surrounded. It has this beautiful frame around it with all of these kind of archetypes of monsters from film and literature. And so this core argument that you make, we've sort of took it for granted, I think, and dove in very deep. But talk to me a little bit about this core argument about the monsters that we create and what they tell us about ourselves.
One of the things I say is that there are no monsters, but all of them are real. And we start with the all of them are real part. monster is a label. It's a label for things that don't fit categories. And the moment you have a classification system for, things out there in the world, anything that doesn't fit your bunch of categories is a category breaker or a monster. And so kind of this book is about, the monsters at the edge of the category of the human. And, I would argue that the idea of the human has never been universal. It's always been contested and it's always been changing. And so if we trace, that line of where the boundary was between human, all of those edges, because it's always been relational, we can actually see monsters in the foundations of, all sorts of kind of laws and our urgent questions today about labor and gender and, the legacies of colonialism and our relationship to the ecology. They're all built on a foundation of how we understand the boundaries between different kinds of human groups and between humans and the non-human.
When we talk about specific monsters, I suppose, because obviously I think we could find examples of this, but I'm wondering, is it the norm or is it the exception that the invention of a monster is an intentional expose of sort of human foibles? Do you think that most authors or even early storytellers, back when we had these stories in the oral tradition, that these inventions of monsters were intentionally created to as sort of a warning or as a reflection of our own, I don't know, our own foibles? Or do you think that they evolved in that way?
I think there's an enormous kind of variety of settings and purposes that monsters in the kind of early sources kind of serve. And some of them are just, people trying to understand what they're seeing in the world and what they're identifying as not being normal. So the ancient Greeks talked about monstrous births, so kind of individual births of people or animals that were very strange, like say a two-headed calf, and they thought they might just be the accidents of nature, or they might be signs, divine signs of some punishment to come, or actually be a punishment. But they also thought that human bodies and minds were malleable, and they would be affected by the kind of geography, the climate you lived under, what you ate and did. And so in distant places where the climate was harsh, theoretically you could get to places where the people were denatured. They had been monstrified into what were called monstrous people. So they were all eaters of human flesh, or they were all apple smellers, who didn't eat but simply, consumed smells, because of their climate. And so what that kind of, and that was a kind of like a scientific way of explaining the variety of beings in nature. It was on the one hand, you defined norms by saying just where they ended, but you were also, it was also a kind of way of potentially defining excellence, and that word prodigy, which used to be like an extraordinary birth that might have some deep meaning, has retained today that sense of excellence. And so here's the thing: as you become more and more different as, say, I don't know, a performer, there comes a point when you may be so good that you've really almost broken the category of the normal athlete or the normal pianists, shall we say. And so you have these kind of observations that people then tell stories about. As to the kind of invented ones, I mean, if we can move forwards in time a bit to stories we know a little bit more about. I mean, there are kind of utopian kind of missions behind, it's kind of huge, cultural franchises like Star Trek when it began. Go back a few hundred years to the 17th century, and this English aristocrat, Lady Margaret Cavendish, wrote a sci-fi novel. So there she was in the mid 17th century. She didn't get to do all the stuff she wanted to do. She was self-taught. She published poetry, scientific writings, satires, a play or two, and she wrote a novel in which a woman who is kidnapped and taken off in a ship ends up. This ship is blown off course, I think, ends up at the North Pole, where this Earth touches another. Everybody who kidnapped her kind of dies of the cold, which is really convenient. And then she walks off the ship and meets these, people in this other Earth who are actually animals who, stand on their hind legs and speak, not English, but they speak. And so what's striking about her imagined, world of these animals who behave like humans, and they have kingdoms, and there's a court, and they just happen to be bears and geese and beavers and whatnot. She couldn't imagine a place on this earth where her skills would be fully respected. And so she imagined an earth where the beings were not even people. So it really was a kind of way of imagining a better world for people like her by kind of pushing her way out of seeing society as being one populated with regular people. She was living in animal land. It was almost the Muppet Show before the Muppets.
Yeah, it's interesting to see kind of two sides of that utilization, or that fantastic creation of these monsters, right? We often think of monsters having this quite negative valence, but you've described so many examples, even to this point in the conversation, of monsters as ideals, or monsters as friends, or monsters as sort of a retreat or protective opportunity. I think about, oh gosh, the Guillermo del Toro, the Pan's
Hands?
Labyrinth
Yeah.
film. Yes, and the thing that I love so much about this is that it's never quite made clear if this is all an invention of her mind to escape sort of the treachery of war, or if this is a fantasy film in which like all these things are real. I prefer the first explanation, but some people prefer the second. I would love maybe to talk for a moment about something that you brought up in that description of Cavendish, which is the animalia. The sort of, when we think about monsters, they are a reflection of our humanity. And when we think about the idea of in-group and out-group and self and other, we often grapple with this concept of like somehow the human is separate from the animal. But obviously we know scientifically we are animals. And so I'm curious about, I'm sure you've grappled with this topic quite a bit, of our relationship to animals and the animals' relationship to our sort of invention or creation of monsters.
The dilemma with apes, and where does kind of human end, and where does the kind of simian world begin? And in early Christian thought, there was a hierarchy of beings from the lowliest up to the humans, and they could proceeded in steps. And the kind of apes were just below us. But individual people, if they were badly behaved enough, they could kind of like slip backwards, as if being a kind of a full human was also partly a spiritual and moral contract. So there was something kind of conditional about it. So beings arranged in a chain with nice separate links, but there was always this possibility that you could slip back into the poor relations, the beings who were as close to but not fully sentient. And in the kind of 16th, 17th centuries, you have European naturalists kind of running experiments and writing treatises about how humans are separate from apes. And there's a kind of wonderful account of the diarist Samuel Pepys in the 17th centuries. He writes about rushing off to the docks in London because he's just heard of an extraordinary creature called the baboon that had been brought on a ship from West Africa. And he heard, from the ship's captain that there's a whole species of this extraordinary being, this extraordinary kind of simian in Africa. But for Pepys, it's kind of unimaginable. He thinks this has got to be a creature that's half human and half baboon. So as he says, a monster god of a man and a she-baboon. And so he's okay with a one-off human-animal hybrid, which is the opposite of how we would be today.
It's interesting how often you do see this in classic literature. These, and sometimes they're presented as terrifying, and other times they're presented as like superhuman, right? As these like mystical beings that are, part man, part beast, and they have these really cool powers, and there's something that we almost like revere and aspire to.
Yeah, and of course he's fine with the idea of an actual human-animal hybrid, because this would then be a one-off extraordinary being, a monster. Whereas if this were a normal species, then the gap between humanity and the next closest, ape species would be smaller.
Right. And that's threatening to our superiority.
Yeah, because those steps on that great chain of being have suddenly become smaller. But of course, so that's like a macro example of how people have thought about the boundary between the human and the animal. But at the micro level, we now think about the human being almost as we're this giant like piece of luggage in which a host of kind of bacteria live inside us, on our skin, and they tweak our temperaments, our moods, what we want to eat. And so the very idea that of me saying I'm an I rather than a we is simply a story we tell ourselves. And so if we think of like human beings as being like each one of us is a one, within that kind of logic, what we actually are, which is this microbiome with a big animal around it, well, that's mind-blowing. I mean, that's like each one of us is a Borg cube.
I don't know why we're not having this conversation more, I suppose. This conversation of the fantastic as a stand-in or as a metaphor, as an allegory for many of these, I don't want to call them mundane, but these fundamentally human and like really existential grapplings that we have within ourselves, within our communities, within our kind of global positioning of ourselves. One thing that came up for me, and I don't know if you touched on this, and I'm curious, I'm curious if it's something that you're even interested in discussing, is the phenomenon in which certain people truly believe in monsters, like that there's actually the mythology and the lore becomes so intertwined in the cultural narrative that there are, people who believe that there actually are these mythical creatures, that these examples of human whatever extremes serve, I guess, as cultural warnings or cultural guardrails, and they become so imbued that individuals truly believe that like there is a monster in that loch, or that there are these, elves that will do things at night to make sure that tourists don't slip on the moss, or whatever the case may be.
The premise that certain people believe in monsters. Well, what do we mean by monsters? I mean, I want to say kind of potato, because, modern science has monsters all the time, and they're called new discoveries. Oh, a new species. So there's different kinds of language for referring to category breakers. They're not always called, monster, or like the equivalent term, say, in a European language. So in the West, they may be called something like monster, or, in science, we say new discovery, and that is basically a life form that is not in the book. And this is what, a few hundred years ago, the same, scientists in the same places would have called a monster. So there's that kind of thing where there are just other words, and sometimes kind of with a charge. The word kind of blue stocking was, a pejorative way to refer to a woman, wanting rights and independences that weren't available to her a century ago, for example. But just to come down to the more, straightforward, monster theories like the Loch Ness monster, or there is this field of cryptozoology, which is the search for those for the monsters that are there but haven't been truly found and proven. And I'm not a psychologist, and this is maybe really more your wheelhouse. Searching for things that haven't yet been found, it involves hope, and it may be all kinds of different hopes are pinned on a being, so that you have a way of feeling that at least someone is in control of some aspect of your interest that you cannot, whether that's kind of elves who will place some limits on the actions of tourists, or beings who will kind of watch over people. On my kind of gloomier days, I will kind of sit and think, when are the Vulcans going to come and like fix everything and like shout at the bad people? And that is a kind of the same thing. This is what, someone without a spiritual bone in her body, will sort of roll her eyes and like wonder why, we are living in some ridiculous simulation of some, much more intelligent and powerful species, and kind of irritatingly, demand that she's taken out of the tank. And I wonder whether this is about, people as storytellers. People are, I think, seem to instinctively organize things into groups. And this is how we process stuff. We were little mammals, in the forests, looking out and needing to figure out what berries you could eat without being poisoned, and very quickly classify, the threats when we were not the biggest thing out there. And I wonder whether that is a form of storytelling that is a way to deal with all of the unknowns, many of which are scary and seem like these big looming things. And, maybe there's a big looming thing that's on your side, in your gang.
It is fascinating the many uses. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the utility of monsters throughout human history, that these, whether they were intentional inventions to serve a specific purpose, or whether they evolved through chatter and meaning making of sort of natural phenomena, that these beings, these creatures, these beasts, these hybrids, these forms served and continue to serve so many purposes to humanity, and really that does bring us back to that idea of the human as that center, that the human perspective, that sort of we are all the main character in our own play. That these monsters either are serve as warnings to keep us out of danger, or they serve as you mentioned, sources of hope that maybe something will come to save us from this chaos, or to save us from death, or to save us from suffering, or that they serve to justify violence and bigotry, that this human is not really human. This human is subhuman and more like a monster, and therefore it's okay for me to treat them in a way that violates their civil rights. It's fascinating how many roles monsters have played throughout human history. Are we leaving any out that you've stumbled upon in your kind of scholarship? Other purposes, I guess we could say.
I was thinking also about kind of gods, because so often, stories about gods and humans involve humans being made out of gods, in a god's image, or gods themselves, give birth to various kinds of beings. And of course, if the child is different from the parent, technically the child is a monster. It's broken the category and become something else. So kind of monstrosity is kind of built into the way kind of some kind of the kind of divinity is even imagined. And I guess we've talked about the kind of human boundary with ecology and animals, and across types of humanity. And then there's also kind of machines, which are a kind of monster type for our age, because now it's kind of all humans are being framed as unnecessary, because machines are supposedly going to do the work. Where then the consumers are supposed to come from, I know not.
Yeah, I mean, it is a whole other category that I never really thought to relate to this idea of a monster, but it checks so many of those boxes for sure. And I guess one more comes up for me, and I do think it's related. It's not completely separate, but we talk about this monsterification of the other, of the outgroup, but there have been these historical examples, and with through modern science, we've been able to explain many of them, modern medical science, but of human beings themselves with genetic anomalies, with what we call teratogens. By definition, that word teratogen, right? Monster forming. That's what it actually translates to. That a mother during pregnancy might imbibe some sort of toxin accidentally, and it causes some sort of anomaly to the fetus, and then when that child is born, or stillborn, sadly, that there is something monstrous, quote unquote, about it. Either like anencephaly, it's lacking a cortex, a brain, and so its head looks very, very strange, or it has webbed feet, or there's so many examples throughout human history, and I'm curious about some of your scholarship there, if you've dug deep into the idea of the human monster.
Yeah, there were some extraordinary to us explanations for kind of individual, children being born with, atypical bodies. And one was that monstrous births were caused by the mother's imagination.
Oh,
So
God.
during
It's probably always
pregnancy,
mom's
it's
fault, though, right?
always, it's
Yeah, it's always the
extraordinary. Like,
woman's
when is it
fault.
not?
Yeah.
So the idea was that mothers kind of, mother could imagine things, or fantasize about people, and that would make her, unborn child look like them. Equally, if you frightened a mother by showing her, a portrait of a monkey, or in one case, there was a woman who went to Leadenhall Market in London and was frightened by a lobster and gave birth to a lobster child.
Oh, God.
So yeah, this connection from the mother's mind to the child's body was happening at a time when paternity couldn't be tested. This is centuries before genetic testing. So there's this kind of would have been an anxiety potentially around a child who didn't resemble the father, but maybe resembled someone else in the community. And so, you could, make the argument back then that the mother might have, committed adultery in the mind, even if she hadn't actually done it with the body. And that's why the child looked the way they did. So that was one possibility. Another possibility was that God was sending a sign. But then the thing is, well, how do you read the sign? And these monsters don't arrive with a tag attached. So people would try to evaluate from how they felt about them what the monster meant. Whether this was just an accident, because sometimes nature makes a mistake or plays a joke. Whether the mother had just had an unfortunate, accident, or whether this was a sign or a punishment. And so when you see those people fighting over those explanations, we see that today as well. What caused the floods in some place? Is it climate change, or does someone control the weather? I mean, some of these stories are nothing more or less than lies, and we have to kind of be ready for that in the past as well, without kind of assuming that every testimony that is strange is simply somebody foolish or somebody lying. And then, that's the great challenge.
Well, and I can imagine that a challenge that maybe has come up for you, and I would love sort of, unless there's something that we've missed, I'd love for sort of as a closing contemplation to discuss a little bit with you this concept of our relationship to monsters and our personal awareness of the human relationship to monsters. So I say that in the context of reading your book, looking at the connections that you make. It's so fundamentally important to not ignore and to really grapple with our historical and our present cultural, individual, but also cultural relationship with monsters, because it does affect, or it is an effect of how we relate to our fellow human beings. And so many people probably haven't even taken the time to dig deep, and in doing so, really do a lot of kind of self-work and introspection. And then on the flip side of that, here you are as an academic scholar, but also personally digging into this on a regular basis. And I know what it is to be steeped in a topic. And so I'm curious from your perspective, like, do you see monsters everywhere? Like how do you now go through life with this frame, and how does it continue to affect you?
I do see monsters everywhere, but the word monster for me is very capacious. It just means category breaker. It means exception to the rule. So what I'm seeing is storytelling about what categories are normal and expected. And so I guess I'm often seeing, sets of categories that are incomplete, because it's where things are incomplete that people then, instead of saying, oh, whoops, we forgot something, they can either make that decision, oh, like we need to make some more boxes, or decide there's something wrong with you, you don't fit the boxes, or decide, well, why do we need boxes? We live in a continuum. So I guess I do look around and see stories that are made, around, for example, reparations for slavery, or just the structure of third world debt, when you consider, how much of Europe was built with the labor and the resources from the so-called third world. And so I feel like there are stories built into some fundamental international organizations that are about papering over forms of monstrification in the past and somehow continuing to benefit from them. But I also feel as if that the alternative, better ways of thinking about difference are are out there in fiction. There's a kind of, whether it's utopian sci-fi, or children's television. And that is also very striking, the things people make for genuinely for children. They seem to kind of find their best selves, and those shows manage to get greenlit. So it's almost as if people know how they should behave, but a combination of greed, circumstances, ego, structural problems mean they don't behave that way as often as they should.
I love that during that explanation, you use that word that you've used a couple of times so far, monstrification. I think that
Uh,
even just including that in our vocabulary
I
changes
would
the way
love
we
to
think
see
about
that.
this concept. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
monstrification, and then in a future in which everyone is wondrous and unique and monstrous in a good way, no one would be a monster. So
Yeah.
that's a kind of monstro-futurism, a better way to be.
Ugh, I love it. On that note, I just want to thank you for spending time with us today, for your scholarship, for putting these fascinating ideas into the written word so that we could all enjoy them, and for sharing some of these concepts with us for I think further grappling. It's been a lovely conversation.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Everybody, the book is Humans, A Monstrous History by Dr. Sareka Davis. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.